Okay, we're good to go. So I think first and foremost, it's just a thanks to Simon for reaching out and offering me the opportunity to share some of my learning from a project I did as part of my postgraduate study with Edinburgh Napier University, looking at the role of coach developers in early detection and prevention of burnout in sport coaches. And while I'm not a psychologist, as Simon said, I do have a research interest in this area, largely because I have struggled with and experienced burnout myself as a coach. And so I engaged in study and continue to engage in reading and research in this area to make sense of what my experience was, and hopefully that can inform how I support coaches through some of the work that I do as a coach developer and moving forward. Now, Simon pointed to the fact that we'll be using the chat function quite a lot tonight. Simon, I can't actually see the chat box at the moment with the mode that I'm in, but what I would ask us to do is just to start populating that chat box just now with just some thoughts around what motivated us to be here, and what we're hoping to learn from tonight's session, why we're hoping to learn that, and more importantly for me, where do we hope to apply that learning in the context of our work as club leaders, as officials, as policymakers, as coach developers or coach educators. I'll just ask us to just start doing that just now. And once we've finished that, I would also ask us to consider this question. Again, perhaps populate it in the chat box, but if you feel you would rather do that personally, I would just ask you to perhaps to begin populate a sheet of paper or a notebook with what you know currently about stress or burnout, and that sheet of paper is going to become very important as the session goes on. So I'll just give you 1 minute to just either start populating the chat box or start writing some notes for yourself just now. Okay, so are we starting to get some stuff in the chat box?
Yeah, we've got one in there from Lisa. So Lisa is chatting about hoping to apply it to the coaches she manages and signpost information to clubs when they need support or trying to develop. Vinny has come in with to identify signals of coach burnout, and then Damien saying he thinks it's a growing area of concern as coaches need support too, as well as supporting their athletes, obviously. I want to look into early detection signs, possible remedies. Good coaches are hard to replace, so we need to look after them, which I think we'll all certainly agree with that last point. Kath have seen coach burnout and would like to be able to prevent it happening again. Also hopefully help repair damage. Michael, stress and burnout are major issues in relation to retention and well-being. How can we support coaches to holistically avoid or reduce this? How it affects your performance and interactions with participants. Then we've got Jen has come back with, I think many coaches take on too much, especially in the COVID environment, which again, I've seen myself in that as well. Andy, interested to in how to advise players who move directly into coaching without much formal training, how to prepare them for the stresses that may surprise them. Fran, workload as a coach is a big issue, balancing work, voluntary coaching, and family life. Yeah, there's quite a lot of stuff coming through there.
Thanks, Simon. And I'm assuming they'll keep coming as we go along, which is perfectly fine. So to kick us off for this session, what we didn't necessarily want to do was to chuck a lot of knowledge at you without necessarily positioning it within a story or a narrative to enable that to make sense. So what I'm going to do is tell one story which has intersecting narratives. So there's 5 perspectives of a burnout experience within the context of this these next few slides. And what I will ask us to do is to, in that paper that you've started to generate some notes on, is build a picture of what your understanding of this story is. We'll revisit this reality that you create over the course of the presentation. And as we start to develop further knowledge around what stress and burnout is, as we co-create perhaps some strategies towards the end of how we might support early detection or mediation of stress and burnout within the coaches that we work with. So you'll forgive me when I talk through these slides. Some people might want to read them. Some people might just want me to narrate while you start generating your notes. So both options are there for people. So I'm going to talk about a hockey coach, and her name is Kim. Here's what the club chair says about her. When we hired her, we didn't realize how dynamic and resourceful she would come to be. She seems to be all over everything and going out of her way to respond to any requests we make, and has never said no when we needed her to pick up some slack elsewhere in the club. The players seem to really respect her, find her really accessible, and can pick the phone up night and day should they have any concern, need feedback, or advice. More importantly, we're winning every week. The club is buzzing, and we're getting more and more players joining because of our committed approach and how vibrant she is. The next perspective is from the first team captain. I don't know how she does it. To be a solicitor, have a young family, and give all that she does to the club is incredible. The energy she brings to the changing room on match day and on training nights is infectious. And you can tell how much she's invested in the future too. Spending time making sure some of the management structures of the club are modernised, and ensuring she's visible with the academy and junior sides too. WhatsApp never seems to stop though. The players are at different stages in their lives, so they have the time to keep the chat going and regularly tag Kim in, and she's so quick to respond. Regularly taking things offline if some of the players need some help with anything that isn't hockey related, like finding work for some of the students that have just arrived. We then move on to the assistant coach. I've known Kim since playing together at the club from when we were juniors. I know when something's up, and I think she's hiding something from me at the moment. I've noticed her crying in the car before or after training, and she's becoming more and more disillusioned with the committee. They don't seem to care about anything except winning. The pressure she's putting on herself, or putting herself under, is enormous, but she just won't speak to me about it. Some of the people on the committee are a little bit concerned with the tone of her communication of late. I mean, Kim copied me into a couple of the emails to the management, and you can sense her frustration about having to take on too much. We move on to the coach. I've not signed up for this. I spend nearly all my spare time here or doing things for the club because nobody else can be bothered. I was hired as the first team coach, but find myself embroiled in dealing with committee stuff, recruitment, logistics, dealing with parents and partner clubs. Never mind the growing list of things that the players are asking me to help them with. Helping find a job, sorting out a flat, references for university. It's hard to leave it at the door when I'm getting emails, texts, and calls at work too about it. It's almost impossible to escape. And of course, it isn't fair to bring it home when all the wee ones want or need is my attention. The last thing I want to talk to Danny about, and probably the last thing he wants to hear, is the pressure that keeps building up with the club. So I sometimes withdraw at home as I find the situation is all-consuming. Perhaps it's just time to walk away. It isn't worth it anymore. I'm absolutely exhausted, and I feel like I'm getting nowhere at the club. I kick my pan in, week out, and for nothing, and with very little help. Work doesn't seem to be suffering though, but I definitely feel it with Danny. And the last perspective is Danny. She comes home pretty quiet and looking exhausted most evenings after training. Even though she's winning most weekends, it isn't enough to put a smile on her face. I really want to be here for her and talk to her about it, but I guess she feels guilty at spending more and more time away from the kids. I can see how her bottling things up, and it's beginning to show in how snappy she can be at the slightest thing at home, like when the kids' toys are lying around at the end of the day. I get she puts a lot into coaching. It's something she's passionate about, but something is going to have to give. It's a bit self-perpetuating though. She's been successful at the club, and the region have come asking for her to work with a pathway squad and do some coach development. I'm happy to support Kim in chasing her dreams, but there will come a point where she needs to recognize what it's doing to her. At this point, I'll ask us to pause and reflect within the notes that we've taken and question, what have we come to understand about Kim? At this point, Simon, if anybody wishes to share anything in terms of their thoughts, curiosities, I would encourage them to do so in the chat. The other point I would make is we probably all know a Kim, or we have been in Kim's shoes at some point or another. So again, feel free not to share if this is something that becomes personal for you or triggers something in you because of that story. Now, what I would ask us to do is to keep this picture that we've built in our mind of Kim and the situation she finds herself in as we start to explore some of the underpinnings around stress and burnout. And as we go through it, we'll again ask you to reflect upon the reality that you've created and consider what the new knowledge you now know tells you about the situation Kim is in. So I'll move on. Now, what I will say is this is primary research. So this is a synthesis of a lot of the research that's out there on sport coaching in relation to stress and burnout. And it might seem like it's laden with stories of or research from high performance, but I will also present where it also talks to the community game where we all find ourselves situated in as well. So first and foremost, it's pretty clear in the research that it's demonstrated that coaches experience stress because of the nature of their job, and it can affect their physical and mental well-being. To give ourselves a working definition, well-being can be wrapped up in being referred to as a person's psychological functioning, satisfaction with life, and their ability to create, to maintain mutually beneficial relationships. It's also related to the ability to self-manage the workload, which started to come through in some of those reflections from you guys on the webinar, associated with their role as a coach, as well as greater autonomy over coach-related tasks and activities. It can be defined as the whole process from stressor to strain, with strain being an individual response to the stressor itself. Now, within that, it is also a particular relationship between the person and the task and or environment that's being appraised as taxing or exceeding their resources. Most importantly, though, is that it's mediated by personal and environmental factors such as the beliefs that we hold, the assumptions that we make, the attitudes that we have and the attitudes that are reflected back towards us, the culture we find ourselves in, and the values of ourselves and the organization or the environment wherein the person is situated. It's also important to stress, there's that word, it's also important to note that stress is not unidimensional and it's not always negative. There are ways in thinking around it in terms of negative appraisals. And when we talk about negative appraisals, what we're talking about there is appraisals of stress being considered as distress. where the person may view stressors as potentially harmful or threatening. And when we talk about positive appraisals, we're talking about eustress, where a person may view stressors as an opportunity or a challenge to be overcome. And put simply, de-stress is associated with demotivation, and eustress is associated with motivation. And that becomes crucial and important as we move on. Now, coaches do experience a variety of stresses that include athlete performance, other coaches, organizational pressure, and staff conflict. And their psychological, physical, and behavioral response to that stress is likely to be detrimental to their effectiveness and general performance as a coach. Like we talked about earlier, and some people made a point on this, that coaches, like athletes, may struggle to manage the demands that they encounter. And as a consequence, those stresses will not only negatively impact upon themselves, but can also impact on the athletes as well. And I want to just bring our attention to a concept called emotional contagion, which in essence means that our stress is in of itself contagious within the environment that we find ourselves in. And there's stories in the literature of athletes' awareness of this and coaches' anxiety and stress, and would intentionally or purposely not interact with the coach in advance of competition for fear that their anxiety or their stress will be passed on to them. So there's clear stories out there where athletes are aware of coaches' ability to manage stress and anxiety and in and of themselves withdraw from or do not interact with coaches in the competitive environment as a consequence. So yeah, which leads us to talk about this point around there being an impact on the coach-athlete relationship on the whole, with reduced athlete confidence, impaired performance, dissatisfaction, amotivation, and ill well-being being reported by athletes. Now, again, like I said earlier, that it is laden with stories within the high-performance sphere, but there was a recent study, in fact, published this year by North, Rankin, Wright, Piggott, and Ashforth, which basically surveyed up to around 1,200 coaches around some of the issues and problems they face with in coaching, and the support networks that they lean upon within the context of their environment. But similar to what we highlighted within the research from the high performance space, there is consistencies with what they perceive to be issues and problems, or dare I say it, stressors, within the context of their role. So with the exception of problems with facilities, which sits on top for coaches in the community, there are consistencies around problems with other coaches, problems with player-coach interactions, problems with club management, and of course there's the additional stressors of working with parents and the financial pressures of balancing what it's like being a coach with working full-time or part-time. They also point to knowledge and skills being a stressor for them as well, which impacts on their feelings of confidence and competence in the environments that they're operating in. Now, that's just a high-level summary of stress, and I'll ask us to pause again and just think about how this helps us to understand Kim's story. I wouldn't necessarily ask us to put it in the chat at this moment in time, but I would ask us to add it to the notes to keep building that picture that we've started to create of Kim. Cool. So now that we've got a picture of what stress is and a couple of working definitions around well-being, we start to get into the crux of understanding the burnout experience itself. So when exposed to prolonged periods of stress or an accumulation of chronic stressors, and they could be different stressors, over time, coaches may begin to experience burnout when they perceive their demands placed upon them exceed their resources to cope, which is fairly consistent with our understanding of stress thus far. Now, within burnout, it's really, really important to recognize that it's an enduring psychological syndrome. It doesn't just happen overnight. So it represents a slow and creeping process, which makes it really, really difficult in terms of detection, because it could manifest itself over the course of a single season or a number of seasons. And sometimes it might be too late before we recognize what these symptoms actually mean, because it does take such a period of time. So as we said, it doesn't necessarily represent an event, so you don't necessarily go through a really tough training week and then at the end of it say that you're burned out. Like I said, it represents a process in which individuals anticipating a sense of meaning from their work alternatively face disillusionment and diminishing motivation towards it. Now we start to then consider what distinguishes stress from burnout. And burnout, like stress, is multidimensional. And there are three key dimensions of it. So first and foremost is overwhelming exhaustion, and that exhaustion could be considered both emotional and physical exhaustion. Feelings of cynicism and detachment from the job, which is also known in the literature as depersonalisation, and it's associated with a lack of pro-social behaviour and professional inefficacy. And there's also this sense of ineffectiveness and a lack of accomplishment, where people feel really demotivated and really struggle to take any positives from the job that they do. Now, Lee and Ashforth noted in their research that the manifestation of emotional exhaustion came first in the development of burnout, with depersonalisation and a reduced sense of personal accomplishment emerging thereafter. And the interesting thing about the emotional exhaustion piece is some of the problems that begin to present themselves as a consequence, which is sleeplessness, insomnia, and therefore further fatigue, physical fatigue, which only serves to perpetuate those feelings of emotional exhaustion. So it does become all-consuming over time. And I suppose the presence of these three dimensions alongside one another differentiates burnout from stress and other psychological conditions which it shares similar symptoms with, like depression, fatigue, anxiety, or lack of motivation. Now, we are in the business of coaching, and coaching is a human endeavor where we do interact with other people and the athletes that we're working with. So fair to say that human relationships are an integral part of sport coaching. And therefore burnout can also present itself as a result of the stress that comes through those social relationships between the helper and the help recipient, which are usually found in asymmetrical professional relationships where the victim is the giver and the client is the receiver. Now, thinking back to Kim's story, are there any asymmetrical relationships that we can identify within the context of that narrative? Because the coaching profession is one such profession where asymmetrical relationships could exist within the coach-athlete dyad. And these asymmetrical relationships are a consistent criterion for studied occupations with more mature research narratives, such as teaching, nursing, and social work, where they are really susceptible to burnout with provider-recipient relationships. But stress on its own, though, is not sufficient to cause burnout. There are some personality traits which lend themselves more to the susceptibility of the condition, with trait and anxiety being the most notable. Coaches with maladaptive, self-evaluative perfectionism, defined by a concern over mistakes, the need for approval, perceived peer pressure, and rumination, display higher levels of burnout. I think before moving on, it's probably appropriate to highlight that stress is in the eye of the beholder, and therefore burnout is a highly personal experience. So what sits within our framework, our understanding of what burnout is, or what stress is for us, may not necessarily be consistent with the person who is suffering from it at that moment in time. And therefore we need to understand the burnout experience from their perspective and not always our own. Now, again, talking about the research being laden with stories from high performance, narratives from high performance, data from high performance. There was some interesting work done by Lundqvist, Gustafsson, Ham and Hasman in 2012, where they conceptualized two profiles of the burnout experience, those being the performance environment profile and the life situation profile. The performance environment profile is associated with problems coping with the culture of performance sport, and it identified themes such as coach identity, largely entrapment, inability to handle the performance environment, perfectionism, and outside pressure to perform. The life situation profile, however, on the other hand, looks at the burnout experience for those who are managing the totality of their situation. Not simply concerned with the team or personal coaching performance, but rather the eventual unbearable consequences of balancing complications at home with a career in addition to sport coaching. Themes emerging for coaches within this profile were unsurprisingly overload, issues at work, widening remit within the sport organisation, disharmony within the team, and negative life events. What I will point to in this profile of burnout, in the life situation profile, is there is evidence of those who were managing or balancing those three commitments between work, coaching, and home life. There was a tendency to deprioritize life at home for the sake of holding it together at work or at the club. And what it does, it just brings home some of the assumptions I have and some of the anecdotal evidence I have from coaches that I speak with and work with at times, is that coaching comes at a huge personal cost. And we need to remember that in the context of trying to make sense of burnout in the context of the life situation profile. What was consistent across both profiles, though, is these organizational sources of stress associated with either the culture of the organization or unfair expectations being placed upon the coaches outwith the scope of their contract, which I think was mentioned in the chat by a couple of people, in fact, more than a couple of people at the start of this webinar. Now, I'm going to ask us at this moment again to pause and reflect and think about how this helps us to understand Kim's story further. Thank you. So again, I'll just ask us to keep building that narrative or keep adding to that story, that picture that we've developed of Kim as we start moving towards understanding some of the things that we can do to provide some support for her. So it's pretty clear in a lot of the research that the absence of effective burnout prevention can and is likely to result in poor related mental health, where risk factors prevail. So if we don't address some of the organizational sources of stress or engage with building a burnout prevention strategy within the context of the organization, then the coach and the organization are likely to suffer long term. And in terms of supporting strategies, there are perhaps three stages or three areas of intervention that we could potentially look at. Primary, secondary and tertiary interventions, with primary being preventative, secondary being reactive, and tertiary being rehabilitative. Difficult to say. Now, what I will point to before we start highlighting some of these things is we need to be aware of the boundaries and thresholds that exist when we start becoming sensitized to or engaging in some conversations with coaches in the area of stress and burnout. With the exception of psychs who may be on the call, by and large, we're not professionals in this space. So we must treat this condition, treat the situations that we find ourselves in with real care around the detection of symptoms of burnout, and recognizing what we can and cannot do within that situation, and when it is appropriate to refer or support the coach to refer themselves. These primary interventions that we'll start to talk about are probably the most important for us to understand in the context of this call, because they're the ones that we're most in control of as policymakers, leaders of clubs, and in some cases, coaches ourselves. So primary interventions are in essence a preventative approach to stress management for the coach. And within these interventions, there's an attempt to alleviate the overall demand placed upon coaches by eliminating or reducing the quantity, frequency, and or intensity of stressors. Thinking back to that first slide that we talked about in terms of burnout, where it is chronic stress or an accumulation of stressors, then it makes sense that this is a fairly logical intervention to start building into supporting the coach. And what we start to do is deal with things like duties, and specifically looking at workload, working patterns, and working environment. So the questions I begin to ask in around this intervention is, does the club chair understand how Kim interacts with the role that she's been given? Does the club chair even understand her inherent work practices? You know, he says she's committed, but does he really know how committed she is in terms of time on task? How often within the context of understanding the duties that Kim undertakes or the working patterns that she takes on, do we recognize that, you know, at times we need to tell the coach, look, put the brakes on, take some time off, family first. We also start to consider some of the relationships in and around this area as well. So promoting positive working practice with athletes, support staff, managers and administrators and officials. And I think there was a few people on this call mentioned, you know, establishing boundaries with players with regards to WhatsApp, for example. You know, I'll take things offline at a certain time, or, you know, I'll mute WhatsApp so that I don't necessarily get the notifications coming in when I've not got set times around doing club work. And also looking at how Kim can build better working relationships and more functional relationships with the management committee at the club, so that they can develop some candor around what she should and shouldn't be doing. We can also deal with role and role clarity. So the coach understanding their role within the organization, and the organization ensuring that there's no role conflict. And what we mean by that is just by asking the coach to take on roles or duties that go beyond the scope of coaching in and of itself, that they are in direct conflict with her effectiveness as a coach in the context of the club. So we talk about things like contracting at that point. So does Kim have a contract? Does she have a job description that she can refer to? Yeah, and is this in place from the start? Or based on where Kim is at now, is it a really good point to just start thinking about the creation of a contract or a job description that she could begin to hold the club to account for when they start asking her to go beyond the scope or do things or pick up some slack? Kim also talked about, or Kim's assistant coach also talked about modernizing the club and the club structures. So how is that change managed within the club? And how is that change managed with Kim in and of herself? So across those four things, we could start thinking about delivering those interventions through skills assessment and development directly with Kim. Looking at educational workshops, some stuff around time management training or support, communication training around assertiveness, active listening, awareness of self and athlete interaction. And I've highlighted formal and informal group discussions intentionally because These are the points at which we set some time in the week or the month or the season where we engage in reviews with the committee. We talk about what's black and what's white within the context of our job description or within a role descriptor. But we also talk about the shades of grey. So what's happening as a consequence of how I engage in my work within the club, what I'm beginning to take on and negotiate within the context of those meetings, what should be a committee or a management role or duty, and actually what sits within the remit of the club coach, because ultimately that's what Kim was there to do. We also talk about active management of the organisational environment. To what extent do management committees, do leaders in clubs get boots on the ground and, dare I say it, walk the shop floor to understand what's really going on for coaches within their environment? The club chair talking about winning being a priority for them, but there's a clear narrative within the story as well around Kim investing time in the junior and the academy. Are there contrasting values, contrasting expectations around building a development program or building a winning program? And does that create tension and stress within the context of the environment as well? I think it's really important to note within these primary interventions, and Cassidy et al. Pointed this as well when they were working with coaches in New Zealand, that primary interventions were most successful when they were done collaboratively with coaches. So it's not something done to the coach, but done something with the coach in order to prevent or mediate early stages of burnout. So that's primary interventions. We also look at secondary interventions. So these are reactive approaches to stress management, which attempt to modify coaches' responses to stressors by increasing self-awareness around thoughts, feelings, behaviours, and enhancing their resilience to external demands. It's about developing psychological skills, primarily around coping, and looking at hardiness and resilience, mindfulness, and anchoring. And there's some really nice work by Zhizh et al. In 2004 around a questionnaire to perhaps support coaches to recognize their beliefs, their assumptions, their values around why they coach, why they started coaching, and anchoring them in that when times are tough. What I will point to, though, in the context of this secondary intervention is it's around an intervention for the coach, and it doesn't necessarily point to the fact that the organisation in and of itself perhaps needs to change as well. So developing hardiness and resilience is great, but it's only as good as eroding the stressors that exist for the coach within the environment. So we would advocate for coupling or doing in parallel a primary and a secondary intervention together. I would also point that a secondary intervention should be administered or conducted by a trained professional and not necessarily somebody on the committee within a club. Finally, we're into tertiary interventions, which we pointed to are rehabilitative in terms of their approach to stress management. And once we've got to this point, it's too late. It attempts to help coaches to cope with or recover from the damaging consequences of stress by counselling them through the problems once they've occurred. Pause for thought. For these strategies to be effective, they must not simply be directed at the coach, but the coach exhibiting signs of stress or burnout may be a symptom of dysfunction within the organisation itself. So I would ask us now to think about, based within those primary, secondary and tertiary interventions, how would we help Kim based on the story that we've told ourselves and the picture that we've built along the way? And I would ask us to just add that to the chat box. So we pointed to 3 different types of intervention that we could use to support Kim or any other coach experiencing burnout. And within that, there are a number of programs that could be designed or deployed to support the coach. But I think a number of you pointed to early detection or being sensitized to the symptoms of stress and burnout probably being number 1. And I think first and foremost, we need to be fairly vigilant in the context of the environment and sensitized to, as we said, those coexisting symptoms of emotional exhaustion, physical exhaustion, cynicism, and really struggling to take any satisfaction from their work. But we also pointed to the fact that the coexistence of those symptoms may in and of itself be too late. So recognizing consistent negative appraisals of stressors within the context of the environment is perhaps crucial, and recognizing how they're manifested in behavior as well. Because if we go back to this notion or this idea that stress is in the eye of the beholder, well, the same stressor could be appraised completely differently depending on the emotional state or how the coach finds himself in the environment at any given time. And so recognizing how something that invoked a response one week, it hadn't invoked a response the week before, and beginning to build a picture and becoming more aware as to perhaps why that's happening. Is there that chronic, that element of chronic stress? Or is there that accumulation of stressors beginning to build up that seems to be nudging the coach into a place where they could be experiencing burnout? Now, being able to engage in such interventions is first contingent upon one thing, which Damien highlighted quite beautifully earlier on when he was sharing some of his fairly honest reflections and his experience with us, which is disclosure. Research across domains reflects the coaches need to be perceived as Superman or woman and not show any signs of vulnerability by asking for help. In fact, suppressing any sign of vulnerability can be regarded as an antecedent to burnout. So it doesn't help the coach in any way, shape or form to suppress their feelings of anxiety, stress, burnout. So what can we do to bring them to the point where they feel safe enough to be vulnerable within the context of the environment? Because coaches, yes, again, at an elite level, have reported a culture in which showing vulnerability and seeking help are regarded as weakness, while suppressing symptoms of burnout and avoiding help seeking is the norm. Now, I would argue that perhaps everybody on this call knows somebody who they would say has suppressed or has not shown vulnerability because perhaps it's perceived as a weakness in them. And we need to think about how we shift the goalposts there a wee bit. Because recognizing the prevalence of masking or suppressing stress and burnout within coaching, clubs have a responsibility to help shift this culture to one in which coaches are actively encouraged to seek help when they recognize changes in their responses to stressors are inherent within their coaching. Coaches could benefit from having someone who sits objectively on the side, not someone who'll explain how to do this or that, but someone who'll ask questions and help coaches to find their own strength. Thus, coaches can afford themselves permission to be vulnerable and ask for help. And this is the point where we start to engage in more dialogue around, well, who is that in your club or your organization? Do you have that person in your club or your organization who checks in and makes sure that coaches are okay? And at this point, I'd be keen for people to unmute and discuss, Simon, if that's okay, before we move on to the final set of slides. I think it's just, for me, it's just some parting slides around thinking about how do we shift the culture to move more towards one where coaches feel comfortable with seeking help, but also dealing with burnout, because ultimately we live in an always-on culture, and so too do coaches, and we know that they exist or inhabit this culture at huge personal cost. And there are narratives out there around a need to reframe burnout from something that is at times presented as a medal of honor to something a little bit more serious for us to stand up and pay attention. Who are the role models out there in terms of coaching in this space? Because we see tons of athletes who stand up and share their stories of battles with and triumphs over poor mental health. But where are the coaches in that narrative? Are they afraid of or fearful of the impact or the consequences that they might be seen as broken, damaged, unemployable, not deployable as a consequence of sharing their stories? Or will they provide strength for other coaches within the context of sport coaching more broadly? Certainly within the context of the research there, the examples of coaches who withdrew as a consequence of burnout are limited. In fact, I found one study with 2 coaches where they withdrew as a consequence of burnout and didn't return to sport. So how many coaches are out there that we're losing to stress and burnout and we don't know it? Do we put it down to what we see in terms of surface behaviors and not necessarily the struggles that sit behind that? And therefore, how can we help coaches to find the confidence to be able to stand up and ask for help? How do we help them find a place where they can find more balance between their commitments as a coach, as somebody who works full-time and somebody who has a family at home? I think I'll leave it there, Simon, if that's okay.